So, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We have three adoptive parents here, all musicians, to share some wisdom with us today. Laurence Cummings, who is a conductor of early music and opera, mainly opera, Laurence, or a bit of everything?
A bit of everything, I suppose, but early 18th and 19th, 17th and 18th century. Yeah.
We have Chris Turner-Pierce, who is a tenor, and Sarah Champion, who's a mezzo, I believe. That's right, isn't it? Yeah, great. And all three of you are adoptive parents. This is a series that we've been running for a couple of years now, exploring various elements of parenthood and caring responsibilities within the industry. And this is one that we haven't done before. So I'm really looking forward to speaking to you all. I wanted to start by asking you all individually, one at a time really, whether parenthood was something that was always in your plans early on in your career, or whether it was something that sort of came to you later on. Maybe I'll start with Sarah.
Yes, let me just take away the squeaky dog toy. Yeah, it was always in the plans, and then didn't really happen the way I had thought it would. Ended up being quite a long, drawn out process. But yeah, it was always in the plan at some point.
Yeah. How about you, Laurence?
Well, I mean, when I started working, it wasn't even a possibility, legally, as a same-sex couple. Also, for me, I wasn't in a stable and long-term relationship then. So that all came relatively recently. So I've been with my partner, Martin, for 12 years. And I suppose we married after 2 years, and then that was a sort of natural thing as it had become, possible to adopt. That was something we could consider. And we did a bit of a sort of, Martin thought it was a great idea, then I thought it was a great idea, and he was very worried about it. And so we sort of did the sort of volte-facing between the two of us, and then finally managed to come to a sort of consensus and move forward.
Does Martin work in music as well?
He's a director, so tends to do theatre work and some musical theatre. Yeah.
How about you?
He has done opera, but that's his main thing.
Right. How about you, Chris? Was parenthood in your plans?
Quite honestly, no. I would say absolutely. Myself and Jonathan I've been together almost 15 years now, and Jonathan always wanted to be a dad, and really as a performer I just said that's completely out of the question. And actually, although I was quite paternal or maternal, I don't know which option would be. I love kids. I never envisaged it in my life, and as a same-sex couple, I think I had an opinion in my head of what other people would have had of us as a gay couple adopting, especially when we first got together, because I was much younger and had far less grey hair, or white hair, should I say. So that was, I suppose, the mentality of thinking what other people might think of us was something that held me back. Although I was always told that I'd probably make a good dad, or as it turned out, a good papa. But no, it definitely wasn't on the books. But the longer that we were together, the more that we realised that we wanted not something else, but something different. And I think that's kind of where it all began, really. And we spoke about it for a short period of time. And then one morning, I took the plunge and called our local adoption trust. And 2 weeks later, everything got going. It was very quick.
Mm-hmm. For all of you, I didn't write this in my questions that I warned you I was going to ask, but this just come to me. Were there other options that you thought about and explored first, or was adoption? I know for you, Sarah, obviously it was, but how did you arrive at the decision of adoption specifically?
Well, for us, parenthood was definitely, something we wanted to do. And when it didn't happen the way we wanted it to, or the way we thought it would happen, it was just like, okay, what are our other options? And we sort of didn't draw out the IVF as long as a lot of people do. I sort of said, right, do this many times, and then after that we'll move on to something else. So even, probably several years before, it was always kind of in the back of my head as something that might possibly happen as I hate to think of it as a plan B, but it was a plan B. It was a plan C, really, but yeah. So it wasn't just sort of like one day, boom, let's do this. It was always, well, if this doesn't work out this way, then there's always that other option.
Yeah. Chris, it sounds like you guys sort of went straight for adoption. There was no...
Well, actually, curiously, myself and Jonathan had been together probably for about 3 years, and I've got an older sister. I did have an older foster brother as well, but unfortunately he passed away quite young. But my sister, after we'd been together about 3 years, had said, "Would you like me to be a surrogate?" And if I'm honest, I laughed and said, "No, why?" And she said, "Well, it would still have your genes." She said, we can do everything as we need to do. She also turned around and did say, "I'm 6 years older than you, Christopher." She said, "I've had 2 children. I've really enjoyed being pregnant twice." She said, "It's the most glorious feeling in the world." She said, "And actually, I'd still be involved in the child's life." So that was kind of what sparked the idea for us. It would have been something that I would never have requested that she would have done. But that's what sparked the idea and then got us chatting about it. But then there was only really one way forward for us. Surrogacy in this country is... it's not like America, and I mean, I don't know whether the other adopters can kind of tell you more about it, but it's a very blurry area in this country, because you can't pay someone a salary like you would in the States, or I think it's expensive. So it's a very, very legal area. So, but it would never have been an option for us. But the option was put on the table for us inadvertently, and then really from that point on, that's when we started to talk about adoption, and that would be the only route. As 2 men, unfortunately, we don't have the glorious powers that ladies have to be able to have children. So it was always going to be adoption in that sense.
Right. And same for you, Laurence?
Well, we obviously did consider surrogacy in terms of just talking about it, but we soon dismissed it, partly really just... I mean, I have to say we went in very green around the gills, as I suppose most adopters do, because it's just such an unusual thing to do. But we just thought there are so many children who are looking for homes. It seemed unnecessary to bring another one into the world with all its uncertainties that Chris has just talked about. I mean, we didn't even go into the details. You just know, because it's not a legal thing. And I do know vaguely people who've done it and had very mixed experience. I just know it's complicated, and we just were drawn to the idea of adoption, and so we made the initial approach to Quorum family, who of course, like most of the social workers you meet in the initial stages, are doing everything they can to put you off. Because they can see that you're very green around the gills and think it's going to be beautiful. Honestly, and a beautiful journey.
As they should. It's not for everyone.
Right.
It's not for the faint-hearted.
Yeah.
I was going to ask sort of what the next steps are once you've made that decision. How do you find the agency for you? Or you mentioned a sort of websites, a little bit like speed dating sort of thing. Tell me some more about that. Chris, maybe.
Well, you have 2 options really as an adopter. You can either privately adopt and internationally adopt, which costs thousands. You're talking £10,000 to £20,000 minimum, and the legalities involved in it are what the real cost is, if I'm honest. And it's really hard to actually do. But the other 2 options are that you use a voluntary agency, or you use a trust or a local authority. So in adoption world, we tend to say, did you go the VA route or the LA route? So it's voluntary agency or a local authority. Most adopters will probably opt for the closest agency or trust close to them. And those are normally local authorities. It's kind of an unwritten thing, I suppose, but local authorities tend to have access to younger children in the care system. The voluntary agencies tend to have access to older children. And by older, sadly, that's 2.5, 3.5.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, and actually there's a hugely high percentage of children that are over the age of 2.5 that will not get adopted and will end up in long-term foster care.
We specifically, sorry to interrupt.
No.
We specifically went with a voluntary agency, which just happened to be local to us, but was very small, and they specialized in sibling groups and older children.
Right.
So the reason why voluntary, well, again, it's kind of unwritten, but having done lots of mentoring, the reason, what happens is, it's really tragic actually. It makes me quite angry and upset. What happens is children go into care for all sorts of reasons. The general consensus is that it's a bad reason. It's not always a bad reason. In my children's circumstances, it wasn't a particularly bad reason that most people associate with adoption. But if they're not adopted by the time they're 3 or 4, generally that child gets taken from the local authority and put in voluntary agency care. So sibling groups are very hard to place because many adopters don't want to adopt more than one child, especially if it's their first time. Older children are seen to be more difficult to adopt, or partly because of the fact of sometimes if they come into care later, their trauma will be more, they will remember more. And as a result of it, many adopters are already very concerned about adopting a child where, for example, you may not know anything about genetics. You may not know anything truthfully about what's happened to the child before it arrives in your care. You're very reliant on the social services giving you information, but the information that the social services have is limited to what the birth parents may have suggested has happened. So it's kind of one of those things. So you either have a local authority or a VA or a voluntary agency. Voluntary agencies normally look after sibling groups, older children, or children that have been in long-term foster care who are looking for homes. Local authorities in general, and it's a huge sweeping generalisation, but like I say, it's not really written down, but it is quite truthful in the sense that local authorities tend to have children that are younger and are classified as more easy to place, because unfortunately, most adopters, well, a high percentage of adopters, I used to know what the percentages, I don't anymore, unfortunately, they would prefer to adopt newborns or within a year old. So that means that any child that's over 1 is not necessarily more difficult to place, but will be harder to place than a newborn.
Equally, there's so much bureaucracy that, I mean, for example, we have 2 brothers, half brothers. And in the time that we were going through the process of adopting them, a 3rd baby was on the way. And we were asked if we would like to also take the 3rd child. And we did think about it, and I was for it, and my husband didn't think it was a good idea. And now I know that he was right. But they said, well, you know, if you say yes, you've only been approved for the 2, so you'll have to go through the whole process again, and it'll be another year before that baby even comes to you. So this was an unborn child, you know, that we were taking the siblings of, and then they wouldn't have been able to give it to us for another year.
That's crazy.
It's insane.
I mean, that actually, I've got to say, Sarah, that surprises me, because actually you could have been emergency foster carers before adopting. You could have done early permanency. But it depends.
Would that have had us? We would have then been in a fostering to adopt situation, possibly, which we didn't want to get into.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Anyway.
But no, there's a huge amount of bureaucracy, and the other thing is that there is as well. Our first adoption was really simple, and it was the social worker who we had. It was really incredible. She listened to my career. She listened. I was doing a Domineo at the time. I gave her all the dates. I told her the dates right ahead of time of where I will be available and wouldn't be available. And she took it upon herself to say, right, this is where your dates are. I need to place you with a child that I think is suitable by this date, so that you have time to create a secure bond with this child. Now, I don't think many social workers would go to that extent, but she's really, she was one in a million, actually. And I've got to say, our second social worker was very similar. Very different characters. One was very kind of clinical, upright, wouldn't have a cup of coffee at my house or a piece of cake. You know, I'm a great baker. I bake a lot. Whereas the other one kind of made herself at home within 5 minutes of being in my house, which was bizarre. It was like she was a best friend already, you know. But, you know, each time they got the information they required. But yeah, there are the two. There's the local authority or voluntary agency. And I think you'll hear good and bad about both. But unfortunately, with most children, unfortunately for Sarah, the likelihood is, even though that baby wasn't born yet, the likelihood is it would have taken probably up to a year, if not longer, to get a placement order in place and to prove that both parents were not capable of looking after the child for whatever reason that was. And it's really difficult. So for us, that kind of happened for us with our second child, and he should have came to us at day one, and he actually came to us at 6 months. And he only came to us at 6 months because I literally threw as many legal battles as I could. And within a week of me threatening to go to the media, it was turned around and the child was with us from their foster carer. So
it's the third sibling was adopted, but he didn't move in with his adopters until he was 18 months old.
Shocking.
And he was, you know, the plan for adoption was in place before he was born.
The best thing for anybody involved in that situation.
Because he then had a year and a half bonding with a foster carer, and then that bond was, you know, that attachment was ruptured.
Yeah.
Which is incredibly traumatic, even if they don't remember it when they're older. It's you know, the body remembers that.
Yeah. Laurence, you mentioned that the first step for you was sort of being read a list of reasons that you shouldn't be doing it. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. I mean, we, as I said, went in with sort of rose-tinted spectacles to a certain extent, and went to a few open days. We went to one at Quorum, and then at adoption, there was an adopter there. And you know, you soon realise that you're being ridiculous to a certain extent, and it's not going to be, you know, Anne of Green Gables. And it's kind of, there's just this kind of, but it's also interesting, and you realise that is part of the reason you also want to adopt, because you can help this little person. But we decided to go with the local council. It's always hard to remember why you did that. In fact, you just sort of end up doing things, don't you? And you kind of think, I mean, we must have made that decision for a good reason. But anyway, we did. Went with our local council, Lambeth, at the time. And it took us 2 years to be accepted. It was partly because it was just when they were cutting. It was 5 years ago, so it's just when they were cutting all the services, and suddenly we went through about 3 social workers because they just lost their jobs, and then the next social worker had twice the caseload, and the bureaucracy was immense, but also there were moments where it was as efficient as ordering a replacement recycling bin. I mean, you just felt like you were going from pillar to post, and no one was really sort of following your case, as it were. And you know, you have to write reports about yourself, and the social worker puts it into their words, and then you have to agree it. And at one point, we were reading the report that she'd written, and it was talking about Martin's relationship with Keith, and the fact that Keith had called the relationship off when he decided he wanted to explore his bisexuality. And I sort of just looked up at Martin and said, "I'm not being funny, love, but who's Keith? And he said, I have never, ever been out with anyone called Keith. And they'd copied and pasted it from someone else's. So it was just, and you know, I mean, on one level it's quite funny, but on the other it's just like, well, this isn't funny at all, because this is quite a serious thing we're doing here. So there was moments of you know, total incompetence, but also some lovely interactions with social workers, and the one we had in the end was really very helpful and supportive. But I mean, I do remember the first time, the initial social worker visit, she walked in and she immediately, you know how you just open your door to friends and they'll always find something nice to say about your house, and I really noticed it because she said, well, these windows would have to be changed because our children would throw themselves through these windows. You'd have to cut the garden back. You couldn't have these steps. You'd have to. It was like she just went through this list of things, and you know. And I think she was trying to test us, really, as do the. I mean, you go for an audition as well. You go for we went for 2 weekends, and there were people who weren't at the second weekend because they'd been sifted out. You know.
Wow. What does that consist of? Sort of workshops and meetings?
Yes, and things like there was a card game where you had to put different behaviours into order of, you know, on one side of the board was acceptable and on the other was the unacceptable, and you had to put them in order of what was, you know, and you soon realised that actually all of the behaviours were unacceptable. Things like, would you encourage your child to kiss an older relative goodbye if they didn't want to? Mm-hmm. And obviously the answer is no. But this poor woman got herself into a right old state and started saying that there was a difference between smacking and hitting or something. It was just like, what are you saying? You know, I think that was us as performers looking to her going, no, I really don't think she meant it. As in, I don't think she would have done it. Yeah. She just got herself into this sort of cerebral thing. So it was very difficult from that point of view. And Riley was 5 when we adopted him, which it was older than we were looking for, and actually older than we'd been approved for by a half a year. But he'd been in long-term, they were hoping he could be in long-term foster care with access to birth mum, regular access just to see her. But she kept reneging on the deals because she was still with violent birth father. So that's why he only went into foster care aged 4.5. And at that point he wasn't, he was still in nappies, couldn't feed himself. So he was sort of very delayed and behind. So it took us 2 years to be accepted and then a year to be matched after that.
I have to say that we didn't go in with rose tinted glasses because we had a lovely afternoon with Laurence and Martin, who told us about their experience and set us up for possibly, the worst possible adoption experience. And then ours went much better than theirs. It was
I can still add to this story. I recently spoke to quite a well-known opera singer who's thinking about adoption. I'll keep their name out because it's not something I've discussed with them. And I was, I spent a good hour on the phone saying, these are the things to expect. So you get in contact with your local authority, you get in contact with your voluntary agency, you have your first and second stage. There are 2 stages to adoption generally. I'm talking on the quorum basis, which I think Laurence said that he'd done. Your first stage is where they basically come out and they test you a little bit, but they also look at your finances, they look at where you are, whether you have a mortgage, whether you're in a rented accommodation. They look at all sorts of things, but basically it's the pragmatic, can you afford it? Are you likely candidates? This is before you've had your DBS check, before you've done any kind of educational rounds, which I think was what Laurence was talking about, these kind of weekends where you spend 2 or 3 days kind of with like-minded people and they whittle through who might be able to go into adoption or not. And then eventually you get onto stage 2, which is where you meet your assessing social worker. And they basically spend 9 months. Well, 6 months. It should be no longer than 6 months, but sometimes it's longer depending on availability. And as performers, we tend to be away a bit, so it takes a little bit longer. But they spend about 6 months getting to know you, so they can write what they call a PAR, which is a report about you as adopters, all the ins and outs of your life. Some adopters have even gone as far to say, this didn't happen to us, I have to say. We did get asked certain questions about our sex life, but not massively some intimate things, but some of them did get asked really quite intimate details. But they look at your past history, they look at who you've dated, how long you've dated. For example, if you've been in a relationship where there have been children and that relationship's ended, they will write to that person and ask for a reference. If you still have contact details for them.
And in that time that you are being assessed, does there seem to be any issue with our lifestyle as performers, the way our work is unexpected or,
It's a nightmare.
Is it?
I mean, basically, I think the only way we succeeded in adopting is I didn't really tell them what my life was like, and I lied about what was coming up, and I lied about my plans after adoption.
Right.
It was the only way.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't understand it.
Yeah.
And then they couldn't really see how it was going to work out. So I just sort of said, oh yes, I'm going to take a year off, or I'm going to take, I forget, 6 months off.
I mean, in fairness, it does also highlight how bonkers our lives are.
Yeah.
Because, so little is in your control. I mean, so we're a conductor and a theatre director. Well, theatre is much less ahead of time in terms of its organisation than music. So Martin agreed to take the big time off. But then you sort of have to just say you'll pull out of things if you need to pull out of things. But, you can't put your life on hold. I mean, it would have been disaster for us if we had, because it took us a whole year to be matched.
Yeah.
So we would have had no income for a year. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
And then it was sort of like you're sitting around and then, right, you're matched and like, okay, so I've got this gig. Can I make this work? The date's this. And then I turned something down, and then they called back and said, oh, actually, we've changed your panel date. Then I was like, oh shit, I can do that gig after all. So then I'm like calling back my agent saying, can you make this work? And so then, the day we had our first official day of introductions with the boys, I was actually covering a show on the other side of the country and just like thinking, okay, so I'm going to be with the boys until 1 o'clock. And then if I get the call, then I still have time. I've got the car to drive to where the show is. And, all this sort of gymnastics, trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
But I don't know how you felt. I mean, I felt a lot of the assessing was about passing the test. I mean, it's a bit like passing your driving test. You sort of, you can tell what they need to know.
Yeah.
And obviously, I mean, we didn't really lie, but we fashioned the truth, I think it's fair to say.
Withheld certain bits of information. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think to do with the uncertainty, for sure.
Yeah.
And I mean, thank goodness, from our point of view, the pandemic hadn't been on the horizon, because it never occurred to me that we might have a time when we had no work. Because between us, we'd always had some work. Mm-hmm. So, you obviously have the normal roller coaster curves, but they didn't go that extreme. But I found that all quite stressful, I have to say, that the idea that because I hate the idea of letting people down, and having to pull out of things. But it sort of it did work out. I mean, I wish I'd pulled out of more, to be honest, initially.
When he arrived,
when Riley first came to us, yes, I sort of it was bizarre. I had a particular job where I'd actually put quite a lot of my own money into it, so I would have been losing quite a substantial amount of money. It wasn't just a question of not having the earnings. I sort of self-promote. It was pretty much a dual promotion, and it was doable. It was all rehearsing in London in the daytime, and but I still I mean, it's stupid to have regrets, but I still do think if I was to change one thing, it would be that, just not to have been so stretched at the beginning.
We had sort of forced bonding time because we got the boys in November 2019, and 2 days into my first like proper bit of work back was the first lockdown. So the choice was made for me and everything was cancelled, and there we were in this glorious year and a half of just bonding with our new children and making no money.
And how was that, do you think, in terms of bonding? Do you think that was...
I think it was pretty important. Yeah. I mean, but I was quite fortunate that had there been no pandemic, my husband is a school teacher and he'd taken adoption leave. So he was going to be home for a year doing most of the stuff, and I was going to be sort of coming and going as required. And interestingly, this will be a relevant fact, perhaps not to us in our job, but to people with partners in other jobs. If I'd had a birth child, my husband would not have been entitled to the leave that he received as an adoptive.
Oh, interesting.
So he had like a full year, as if it was like a maternity leave, like as if I'd been a teacher with maternity leave, he got that.
Wow.
Could he not have done shared leave?
Yes, we could have done, but I would have not received very much money. So it made more sense for him to do the full leave and for me to work, as and when. Yeah.
Of course, as self-employed people, you don't get any kind of maternity leave or adoption leave at all unless you're in a PAYE job.
You get statutory, I think. Which is like,
Chris, did you take time out?
I was doing a domino at the time, and it was quite a long tour, so I was away. But as I said, our social worker was quite clever in she knew that things had to move quickly from the point of being approved. So she gave us these 2 profiles, and thankfully that made things very easy for us. Consequently, I've worked with lots of adopters who've really struggled to find a match for whatever reason. There's lots of things at play. So we were approved, and then a month later we were match approved. And then 2 weeks after being matched approved, we did our first bump into, which is where the foster carers and the social workers, the social worker for the child, and also the assessing social worker for us, and the prospective adopters kind of meet in a park or a local place where there can be some interaction, so the social workers can use that as to form their reports as to how well you interact. And then a month and a half after that, our oldest came home. So he was slightly older, so we had to do 9 days of introductions in the foster carer's house. And then on the 10th day, he came home.
That's quite quick. I remember we saw the profile in May, had our final approval panel in June. Mm-hmm. We'd already sort of said that we were keen on the match, which surprisingly was the first profile we'd been given, which felt all wrong, but it just was so right that we went with it. And we didn't meet the social workers, the boys' social worker and the matching family finder came to meet us in mid-July. And then nothing happened until mid-October.
Oh my gosh, that's a very long time.
Yeah.
We were really lucky. That meeting that you're talking about all happened in our home. They came to the house and we had child social worker, a session social worker, family finder, and then a trainee, social worker come as well. They all came at the same time, and they all asked very difficult questions. Actually, I have to say, questions that birth parents would never have to answer.
Really?
Yeah,
that's the thing with adopting, isn't it? I mean, if everybody had to go through the process before they were allowed to have children, there would probably be no need for adoption.
Yeah, I was thinking when you were talking, Chris, about the sort of the quiz thing that you did, those sorts of questions. So you probably all know much more about the way parenting should be done than some of us who, just are sort of bumbling along and haven't had to give it as much thought as you obviously have, and haven't been scrutinized or judged as parents. it must be really, really emotionally very difficult to feel that, and to be questioning yourself, and to be made to feel, you know, am I worthy of this? Am I ready for this? Am I the right sort of person? And I imagine it makes you very self-conscious.
All the time. And I think every option that you take, you second guess, and you're constantly asking yourself whether you could have done it better. In adoption, they really talk about therapeutic parenting. This is an idea or a concept that's been developed by an ex-social worker that also fostered, I don't believe she adopted, but had birth children, called Sarah Naish. And it's been kind of nationwide kind of pushed with adoption as probably the most appropriate way to parent your children that's slightly trauma informed. I've got to be honest, the ideal of it is wonderful. The reality of it is that it's not necessary. It doesn't always work for some children. Some children's trauma prevents them from accepting such ways of access. You know, most adopters will, I don't know, you can say this, you're a birth parent, so I've never had my own children, but you can look at your own children and say sometimes their reaction could be classified as naughty just because they're being naughty. And I think for probably the first year of us having our eldest, I never ever sat there and thought, he's just being a bit of a swear word. You know, but actually now I quite openly sit there and think there isn't any rhyme or reason for this behaviour. You're just tired and being cantankerous, like me at 7 o'clock in the morning. You know, it's one of those things. But for a long time, for a year, I'd sit there and go, well, why is that behaviour? Is it because of this? Is it because of that? You know, and I think that the idea of therapeutic parenting is wonderful. And I think there are aspects that work for everyone. I definitely think the pace side of it does, where you, rather than responding straight away, you give yourself time to think and say, what's the best way to approach this? Is it trauma related? Is it because they've had too much sugar today? Is it because someone said something at school? And I think you have to find, I don't know, your other adopters may talk very differently, but I think you find a little bit of what works for you. We learn our parenting skills from our parents. So during the adoption process, your social worker will be asking what your parents would have done in certain circumstances. Did they smack you? Did they chastise you? Did they ground you? Did they make you eat everything on your plate? Did they, you know, all those kind of things. So that they'll be asking that information inadvertently, because many adopters will fall back on what they know and how they were treated themselves as children. And I think many of us, looking back at our own parents, realised that your parents were just struggling to try and do the best thing. I don't know whether you all know Fran Hill. I probably shouldn't mention her name, but, you know, a repetitor, wonderful, wonderful woman. And when I was doing a Domineo, I started the adoption. She went, can I just give you a little bit of advice? Anybody that looks like they're doing really well really isn't. She said, anybody that looks like a duckling that isn't paddling madly underneath the water, they're not real parents. She said, you will look tired, you're going to be exhausted, you're going to question everything that you do. She said, and if you're not questioning, you're not a good parent. And I think really, I don't know, as an adopter, I feel under pressure to do an even better job than maybe birth parents do. Because effectively, as two men raising two children, and maybe this is a personal thing for me, I always feel like that there's a barrier where, you know, I quite often get asked, you know, is mum at work today? You know, my general answer is, I haven't got a clue. You know, it generally shuts people up. But you know, but with a view of kind of always educating, because that's our job. And it's inadvertently become our job to educate people and say, well, actually, no, I don't know where mum is actually. We've got daddy and papa here. And I was, you know, my eldest, when he came to us, was only like, you know, just shy of 4. And I remember him being at the supermarket and an older lady saying to me, she said, is mommy at work today? And he looked at her, bold as brass, and went, I don't have a mommy. I've got a daddy and a papa. You know, and you know, he was very clear about it. And she just looked at me and she went, is that allowed now? And I looked at her, I think so. And, you know, she never said it in a derogatory fact. Could have been seen as being in a derogatory fashion, but it was just more the fact that she was like, my goodness. And of course, the first 2 male adopters came from Birmingham. You know, that was in the 90s, I think, wasn't it? Early 90s. But no, yeah, I think there's definitely things that we do as adopters that maybe But maybe both parents don't, because they don't have that pressure to say, well, you know, it's okay for you to say to your kids, no, you're not doing that because I've said, you know, I for a long time would say, well, I'd rather you wouldn't do that because you may hurt yourself and that would make Papa really sad because I love you very much. There's always that kind of circle of care and attention, which maybe isn't required when you've had that secure bond from day dot, you know.
Yeah. Laurence,
I think the thing I was just going to add to that, which is that I remember early in the process, one of the most useful questions they asked was, what elements of your own experience with your parents would you take into the process, and what would you not take into the process? Yeah. And I found that a very interesting question that sort of provoked a lot of thought, which was very good. And the thing that was drummed into us, we did therapeutic parenting because we've always thought, if we can, any therapy that Riley needed, particularly in the early time when he came to us, would be better if we were doing it and he wasn't aware that he was being earmarked as being different from everybody else, because he already knew he was different. Was the idea that all adopted children are sort of to the core ashamed. You know, they have this big sense of shame, which they don't even know what it is. They just they realize they're different, and that you must really be careful not to, I mean, use that word, but also if you're, because the thing we found really, really hard, I mean, Riley came to us, he was 5 years old, was bonding and setting boundaries all at the same time, sort of. And you somehow think there's going to be, and you seek advice and you read. Well, in fact, I like reading stuff. Martin doesn't like reading stuff. You just find what your way of coping with it is. And I mean, we definitely erred on the side of bonding rather than the boundaries. I would still say that's where we are at. But I don't. You just make your own paths, don't you? And it's that. But that was for us one of the hardest things. But it also unlocks a huge amount of patience in you when you realise a lot of the behaviour is not willful against you. And I actually think that's something that all parents should know about, really. That you just, because we're so ego driven. I mean, I don't mean us performers. I mean just as people, that you tend to think anyone who counters you is countering your will, and in fact, it's just not their path. You're on two. You may be in the same room and you may be doing the same task. It may be bedtime and you're brushing teeth, but they're not saying no. They won't brush their teeth in order to get at you. And once I sort of unlocked that bit of patience in me, it transformed a lot of things in the world. Riley, about a year and a half ago, was diagnosed with ADHD, because for a long time, I mean, he's always been absolutely delightful, but incredibly difficult to manage. Doesn't listen, finds it very hard to concentrate and focus. And that was always he was on the he had an EHCP through school. That was through his primary school, and it wasn't until this initial lockdown where we realised it was a deep-seated lack of self-esteem, and that's what led us down this path to seek a different way of educating for him. And in the process, we got lots of education psychology reports, and went against what we'd initially thought, which was not to try and make him feel different, but actually, having got the diagnosis, he now owns that, and he knows he's different. And he's actually on medication, and that's made a huge difference for us, but it's also made a huge difference for him. He's calmer, he knows who he is more, the school is very supportive. So it's been a long and rocky road, because I have to say the lockdown for us was a total nightmare, because we had this child bouncing off the walls, not wanting to learn anything, just not being able to do anything that you set. You travel these ideas of stuff to do, and of course the things he really wanted to do, you couldn't do. He's obsessed with trains, motions. We couldn't do any of it, and it was a very, very difficult time, but ultimately we'll be very grateful for it, I think, because it showed us we needed to make a sort of drastic change to his education.
I want to just go back to this topic of guilt that you brought up, because I know as a parent and through speaking to so many parents that guilt is such a strong part of our identity, whatever your circumstances. And I think as a performer or a musician, there's so much of it, because you're away a lot, or for me, my brain is always half somewhere else. When I'm working, I'm feeling the guilt of not being there. When I'm here, I'm feeling frustrated at not being able to concentrate on my work, or feeling frustrated about not having enough work. And so for you guys to have gone through what you have been through to get, to have children, that must be even worse in a way. How do you cope with those feelings when you, for instance, when you have to be away, having made this commitment to be there for these children who've been through a lot often, and you've been really, really highly scrutinized in order to get that? How do you cope with that?
Hard.
Yeah.
Horrible.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, try to cope by doing things like reading bedtime stories over Zoom.
Yeah.
And we did a thing when I was away recently for a long stint, and I would read stories and then I would sing them to sleep over Zoom, and I would sometimes sing for like 45 minutes.
Oh.
They fell asleep. But yeah, it would just like every night it was just like and it's I mean, it's hard for any parent, of course, to be away from their kid, but when you know that there's so much trauma around loss and abandonment and broken attachment, and it's really, really hard, and you sort of question what you're doing and think, am I being horribly selfish to be off doing this fun gig in another country or whatever.
I think that's the hard thing. I think is because sometimes you just think, well, I enjoy what I do, and so therefore you feel bad about that. But I mean, as you're saying it to me, I'm wanting to say to you, well, that's ridiculous. But it's not how I feel about myself. So I totally understand what you're saying. But I mean, we're 5 years into the process, and I would say you just rebuild. I mean, I sort of feel one of our jobs as a doctors is to reprogram their minds with beautiful memories and family memories, and re-establish that. And so you're doing that all the time, and also in a sense you're doing the same thing by going away, because you always come back, and you're kind of so that it, because obviously you're not going to be there forever anyway. And I don't know when it happened. I think it was probably post pandemic. I don't feel guilty about being away so much now, because I know I need to be, because otherwise we're not going to be able to afford to carry on living. So it's and this is how I earn my money, so I can't I haven't got time to retrain or time to take time, or so that's sort of not an issue for me. And of course we're a bit lucky. I mean, Riley's now 10, so for instance he's just been away with me for 2 weeks, because the Montessori like to do everything differently, so they had the longest Easter holiday known to mankind, 4 weeks. So he was with me actually for 18 days. But you have micro guilt as well as macro guilt, don't you? So when I was there the last week, it was an opera, so obviously you have much more free time heading up to the premiere, and not being a singer, I don't have to look after my voice, so I can be screaming in the park, in the playground, and so but even for the 3 hours when I was leaving him with the babysitter, who was absolutely adorable, and I vetted her, and I was really happy with her, and he loved her, but you still feel guilty when you leave the hotel room. and I think that's the same with any parenting, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, but of course you come back and it's always fine, and they've got your number, and you know, so and
But
it's sort of just Sorry, Sarah.
I was going to say, I mean, having gone away for a long stint and come back, it wasn't fine for some time. It was, you know, really traumatic, and it took a lot of time for them to come out of it.
Oh, that's really tough.
Yeah. So,
were you away consistently for a long, long time without being able to come back, or?
yeah. And in fact, you know, when I tried coming back, it almost made it worse.
Right.
Like they'd sort of gotten into their groove at home.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, you know, after the first 2 weeks of being away, I was like, right, I'm going to come back for a weekend. And it just sort of threw them into a kind of confusion and frenzy. And then they came to stay with me for half term, which was nice. But yeah, just, I think part of the problem was in the pandemic, we went from like nothing to sort of everything when everything just opened back up again and everything started. It seemed like it happened quite quickly. For me anyway. I don't know if that was the same experience for other people, but I went from being around all the time, just, you know, like teaching in the studio at the back of the garden, to suddenly gone.
Yeah.
So
do you continue to be monitored by social services, or is there a point where they let you get on with?
So once you have your final adoption order, then they're out of your life. But we had a problem when I was going to be working abroad, and we didn't have our adoption order yet, and we wanted to take the whole family with us because Evan was on adoption leave and the kids weren't in school. So we thought, great, we'll just all go to Denmark for a couple months, and we had a huge battle to be allowed to take the kids out of the country.
Wow.
In fact, one of the things they did was they sought permission from the birth family, which I thought was pretty interesting. Considering
outrageous.
I know, I'm like, what do these people have? You know, what at this point, what right really do they have when they have clearly shown that they
hold the parental responsibility? That's the issue. Until that child goes through the adoption order, they have something like 75% parental responsibility, and social services has 25%.
Yeah.
Or something along those lines. It's ridiculous.
Anyway, fortunately, the birth family thought it was a great idea, and the social workers eventually realized that it was okay, and we were able to take them. And then the pandemic hit, and we all just came home. So.
Yeah, I have to say, because we had a post-adoption worker. I mean, because we, although we did it with the council, we weren't matched with the local council. So Riley's actually from Huddersfield, and so we were in their jurisdiction for 3 years, post-adoption support, and we were accessing the therapy because each adopted child is allowed us quite a lot of money by the government for therapy. And we've done it in physical therapy because Riley's upper body strength was very low. And that we did during the pandemic, actually, weirdly. It seemed like a really weird thing to be doing remotely, but it did work quite well. And he's now been recently doing play therapy. And we're now with the local post-adoption because it's gone over. But we found out that the local authority were ringing school every day to check on his attendance. This was after after we'd had the adoption. Yeah.
Wow.
Interesting. We also access the post-adoption support fund, but we're still with West Yorkshire, where our boys are from, until July. So that will be our 3 years. And, you know, they haven't been too meddling in order to get the money. We keep having these sort of reviews, but they certainly haven't been doing things like phoning the school.
So
as long as you want access to that funding, the government doesn't just give you I think it's 6,000 a year, isn't it, that you have access to? They don't just give you that money to spend on therapy. It has to go through all the right channels, and it can be quite slow. In fact, they did this huge, very, I'm sure, expensive assessment and report telling us that they wanted us to go to see a particular therapist an hour's drive away. And we said, well, we've got a therapist here who was our adoption social worker, who's a theraplay specialist. And we said, well, she knows the boys. We just want to carry on with her. Like, oh, I don't know if we can do that. We've done this whole assessment saying that you need to see this theraplay person who's an hour away, but we managed to convince them. But, rather than just sort of ask us at the beginning, what kind of therapy do you want? And your children. Do you know anybody locally? We had to have somebody from Yorkshire find us somebody in Milton Keynes to do this therapy.
Gosh.
Crazy.
Laurence, this is a little bit off topic, but not really. Have you tried bus therapy with Riley?
Bus therapy? Yes. It's exactly what we did.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah.
We've just done that with our Riley.
Building
Underdeveloped sensory processing.
Underdeveloped sensory. I can never get that right. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's exactly what we did with lovely Sarah. Yeah.
Lloyd.
Sarah Lloyd. Yeah.
See, it's really funny. We've got 3 different adopters and very different experiences of the adoption channel. For our eldest, we didn't have any post-adoption support. And unlike Laurence, actually, we put very firm boundaries down straight away. And I don't know whether Sarah and Laurence will kind of agree with this. When he first came home for the first 4 or 5, 4 weeks, he was a remarkably well-behaved child. He was on his holiday period. Are these people going to keep me? Is this forever? And then after that, I started to notice there's just little not even challenges, but just little changes in his behaviour. In the fact that he all of a sudden went from eating virtually anything and everything to wanting a very beige diet. And of course, food is one of the only things that children can control. A lot of the other control is removed from them, whether it be adoptive families or birth families. And I remember calling our first social worker up and saying, I don't know what's happened. And me, being an adopter, thought, oh God, it must be some trauma that we've caused or that we've opened. Because that's what I did for probably the first 6 months. I constantly questioned what I was doing. And she was very pragmatic. She went, congratulations. Yeah. You're now past your holiday period and now you know what it's like to be a real parent. Enjoy that. Speak soon. Literally that. But we're very fortunate that our eldest had kind of went from birth family to foster carers, and the foster carers were incredibly loving, incredibly nurturing, and when he came to us, he transferred his attachment quite quickly. I wouldn't say it was secure, but the attachment it transferred quite quickly. But we haven't up to yet haven't needed any kind of therapy, any post-adoption, and we're actually way past that now. We've had some challenges, I think, but he's very emotionally aware. He'll quite happily tell you why he's upset, even if it's not straight away. There's a way in with him, but not all children are the same. I don't know what battles we're going to have with the youngest one, because he's not at that stage yet, but but there is support available. But normally only for about 3.5 years, is it, or something silly like that? I think that's the
adoption support fund is throughout their life, I believe.
Yes,
until they're 18, or I think.
Yeah, we're still doing it. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm pretty sure I got told about 3.5 years, but it might be not post-adoption support. It might be something else that the support was there for.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to seek it. I mean, it's kind of, it's like a lot of things. I mean, we've had huge battles with the local education authority in a similar vein, who basically lie to you.
Yes.
Because we wanted Riley's extra support. He needs quite a lot of OT and speech and language, because they were always talking about him catching up. And he's behind on this, but so age 7, they said, we have to tell you that Riley will not make the required standard for year 2. You just think, well, just examine that statement you just made, and he's a 7-year-old. Can you see what's wrong with it? It's the fact that there is a required standard. So we were uncomfortable with all that anyway, and then because he was in a very chaotic, violent home until he was 4, and then he was put with foster carers who basically taught him how to go to the toilet and feed himself for 10 months, and then he came to us, relocation to London, the whole, it's so, there's so, when you stand back from it, you think, well, is it any real surprise that he's not in receive mode when you go to school? I mean, there's so many other things going on. And so it took us a long time to sift through what was delay, what might be, actually, I mean, now he's got this ADHD diagnosis, which is, I mean, it's relatively common it's much more prevalent in adopted children than it is in birth children, but that's also quite possibly, his birth father is in and out of prison all the time. So he's probably also got ADHD or is autistic, or and they say that a lot of the prison population is about undiagnosed mental health, people who just haven't fitted in and then they've spiraled down.
Right.
That was sort of what made us head towards Montessori, because the approach there is very child-led. They're in one class for 6 to 12-year-olds, so they're not compared to their peers ever.
Amazing.
You're just working your own progress. So Riley is behind, but the older ones help the younger ones. So he's always helping sort of 5-6-year-olds, and there he can help them because his maths, for example, is more advanced than theirs. But otherwise he would really. I mean, I think if we'd kept him in a mainstream school, and it's not really to do with class sizes or the quality of the teaching, or it's just to do with the system. It just wasn't suiting him, but when there's so many things about the whole process that when you step back from it, you think, well, special educational needs, surely every child has special educational needs. I mean, we're all different.
I often feel sort of, I mean, I will push for every little bit of extra funding and every little bit of extra support for our kids who have incredibly complex needs because of the trauma they've experienced. And I often feel guilty that my kids are getting this because I see other kids in their school who don't have access to that. And I know that a lot of them really need that help. And, so many kids out there could benefit from these things, and they're not getting it because they're not adopted.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I look at even in my eldest son's class, and from someone who's worked in education before, it's very clear to me that I'd probably say 30% of those kids should be on some sort of educational plan. They should have what we used to call being statemented, which was basically a profile of what your educational needs were, what you were capable of doing, what you wasn't capable of doing. But even when I was younger, if there was such a thing as ADHD back then, you probably would have been seen as a child that was naughty rather than being neurodiverse. And rather than saying, actually, this way of educating that works for maybe 60 to 70% of the kids in the class doesn't work for the 30 or 40%, and we need to find another approach. And I do think that's where education is slightly getting better. But unfortunately, funding-wise, they just don't have the means. This is the problem. Going back to your question about kind of being away and on holiday or at work, we've always called it in our household a holly job. Because let's be honest, sometimes going away from the house makes our life slightly easier as performers. I mean, don't get me wrong, performing can be very stressful, and especially as a singer if you're not very well or whichever. But we've always called it a holly job rather than work. So, we say to my eldest, Papa's going on his holly job, So what I started to do is I had a little lanyard that was for the Royal Opera House. It was orange, bright orange. He went for the luminous one, not the E&O one that was red or whatever colour it was. And he kind of just held on to that. And I said to him, when I get back, you can give it me back. So basically it was object permanence. Something goes away and it comes back. And he clicked onto that very quickly. But like Sarah, I took photos of all of his favourite books, and on the night time, Daddy would call me and I'd read through the book and he'd have the book and he'd turn the page and but it is very difficult. You do feel guilty, but I think like Laurence, the longer he's been with us, the less I feel guilty about going away. Yeah. And he was placed with me while I was still going away. So I'd be at home 3 days, away for 2 days, at home 3 days, away for 2 days. it did mean that sometimes I kept stupid schedules, and I'm sure that Laurence and Sarah will both say the same, where I'd finish a show at 10 o'clock and I'd think, oh, it's 4.5 hours home. I can get home. I can be with the boys when I wake up in the morning. And then realise at 2 o'clock in the morning, while still driving, I was thinking, what on earth are you playing at? You know, and chastising myself on the way home, thinking, you're going to be exhausted, you're going to be miserable, you're going to be horrible. So, you know, but it is. I feel less guilty about it now, though. What I will say is that my children generally are trying to kill me with their horrible illnesses.
No.
That's really trouble with.
Oh my God.
Do you allow yourselves do you forgive yourselves for not always being perfect parents? I feel that this
honestly, no.
I
Oh my God. What is a perfect parent?
Well, I mean, there are certain days.
Not me.
There's certain days where you can just have to. The best you can say is everyone's in their bed, everyone's asleep, and we're all still breathing. You know, that's a day. We've had a day, and the next day will come. You know, I mean, it's kind of you have to lower your standards in terms of because in terms of I mean. I've given up going back over things. I mean, you know, as in, could I have done that better or whatever? Because I mean, usually the answer is, of course, yes. But just to live in the moment and try and use all the, you know, because we have had training, and also, I mean, as you know, Kitty, I mean, you know, you just experience is the main training because what didn't work last time. And I think, I mean, it's in a sense easier. Well, I don't know if you all agree, but as they get older. Because I think the thing you need to do with children anyway is to treat them as people, not as children. Yeah. And, you know, obviously that gets easier as they're older because they become more cogent and more articulate. And you can actually find out what it is that's worrying them or you know. But it's kind of not... I mean, it's interesting. The play therapy is very interesting because it's not theraplay, it's play therapies where you work... You sit alongside the child leads the session, and the therapist, you basically, as parents, you get trained to be a therapist. So you observe, and then you get an hour at the stage where you're actually doing it. And you sit alongside the child plays, you're encouraged to play with them, but not to lead or instigate any of the play. And you voice continually what you think their emotional state is. So you say, you're excited to see the bubbles. You're pleased with yourself that you're able to do a big bubble now. Mm-hmm. You don't ask any questions because that implies that you want a positive response. And I found that particularly because Riley's got to the stage where he's now able to express his anger. It's like Chris was saying, you know, the first time they say no, it's so shocking. It's like, just said no. And now that, you know, and I can see when he's getting angry, and it's so easily diffused by just saying, you're really angry with me because I'm making you brush your teeth.
Yeah.
And
yes, I am.
yeah. And well, I mean, he doesn't usually even say that. He sort of, it kind of calms him down. And then I remind him about going to the dentist, and he loves our dentist, and who it is that tells him, you know, we always blame someone else, who is tells him that has to get to the back of, you know, all those things. And I found that incredibly helpful.
We have two very, very different boys in that respect, and that our eldest loves talking about his feelings. He just
really
he just loves it. And our youngest, it's like a wall has been built around him, and you know, 3.5 years of therapy, and we still haven't managed to get through, and he cannot talk about feelings. He just cannot.
It's difficult as well, isn't it? Because I think, I mean, I don't know, and it's different for every adopter. I think, you know, sometimes I get really upset about the fact of what my boys have to deal with, and I selfishly have to think about them above any other adopters. But I also know that other adopters are going through their own battles, whether that be that there's a diagnosis of ADHD, whether they're, you know, educationally behind or ahead or whichever. You know, and we're constantly taught as adopters that it's stage appropriate parenting and education, not age appropriate. You know, it's all about stage and not age. And you get told that over and over and over. But we live in a system where age really important. All the educational stuff is age related. All the, you know, when a health visitor comes out to you and goes, oh, they're not crawling yet, or oh, they're not toileting properly yet, or it's all age linked. You know, when you have a baby, you have those wonderful charts that kind of do the circumference of the head, the height, and what do they call them? The percentiles. I've never really understood it. My littlest one had one, and every single time the health came, I was like, I don't really understand these. I'm really intelligent, and I don't get it. And she used to say to me, as long as I'm on the same line, that's all that matters. Just don't worry about it anymore. But I do think that it's really difficult. You know, so one of the conversations I've had, you know, and this, and it's amazing, and I'm so proud of the fact that he can articulate himself. But we had a very angry little older boy for about a week. And it was about a month after Mother's Day, you know, and he was just, his anger's often pointed at me, and he'll do anything he can to deliberately not do as I'm asking him to do, because he knows it really annoys me. You know, he knows all my buttons to press. So I just started to ignore it. So I was like, okay, right, let's walk away from it, give yourself some time and come back. And then he escalated so quickly, because our kids go from, you know, fight, flight or freeze. There's no in between. There's for my children anyway. There's definitely no in between. They go from here to here really quickly. And I did that terrible thing, which we're told not to do as adopters, and said, "You need to go to bed because I'm with this conversation." Right? Completely the wrong thing to do. When we're taught, let's sit down, let's do a wonder. I wonder why you're feeling angry. I wonder if you're upset because Papa wouldn't let you watch a film tonight. I wonder, you know, to do all these minutes. So basically, you're asking all these questions inadvertently, which, you know, they clock on to. By the time he got to 6, he was like, "You're wondering, aren't you, Papa?" "Yes, I am." Just like,
I have to say that, you know, when I got punched in the face at Sainsbury's today, I didn't say, "I wonder why you're punched."
You know, and then he went to bed. 20 minutes later, I went up because it had given me time to cool down. I don't think my parents would have given themselves cool down time, if I'm honest. My parents were wonderful parents. You know, being in the adoption, seeing what good parenting is and maybe what not so efficient parenting was. My parents didn't do so bad, to be fair. But, you know, I went upstairs and I said, "Darling, what on earth is wrong? I'm really confused. You're very angry. You're very upset. We've had really difficult behaviour all week." I said, "Darling, Papa's really tired and I can't keep living like this." I said, "We need to get to the bottom of it." And then he literally burst with this frustration of what was going on. He was upset because he couldn't buy a Mother's Day card, even though he'd made us wonderful cards, and he'd made us, you know, schools do this terrible thing of celebrating Mother's Day and Father's Day, and they really shouldn't. But anyway, they do. And, you know, society isn't going to make a concession for my children. I can, the school can, but effectively society won't. And at some point, our children need to realise that. And you know, at 7 or 8 or 9 is not the age to realise it. But you know, he said to me, you know, he got really upset. It's like literally burst into tears. It was horrible to watch. And all you can do is comfort and help them explain more. And he said, I can't send a card. And I went, "No, you can't, darling." I said, "Not now." I said, "If you want to make a card, we might be able to send it with letterbox contact." And what, you know, we kind of spoke about lots of different things. All to do with life story work. But then, and I said to him, I said, "Darling, why haven't you told me this before? You can't live with this big bundle of big feelings and not have me or Daddy help you." And his words were, and it still makes me really upset to say it now, his words were, "I didn't want to upset you." That's terrible. It's horrific that a child his age has to deal with that feeling of that this person because effectively he bonded to me first, even though I was the go away person and work. I became primary carer for him, but then he's having to deal with those emotions, and then that explains all the behaviour that you're seeing at school. You know, the cartwheeling with his willy and weeing all over the floor, or whatever it was, the angry behaviour of tagging too hard or whichever. You know, and once we got past that, he's gone back into his normal, brilliant little self, even though he wasn't not brilliant when he was upset, you know. But I mean, you look at it and you say, well, if our kids are having to deal with that, then no wonder they can sometimes be seen as being difficult in class. And it's so important, I think, for I don't know, my eldest goes to an ordinary school that's not far from where we live, and I've got to say they're absolutely outstanding. It's not a big posh private school. It's not, any other kind of school. It's just a bog standard, what we call state school. And they are brilliant. And for the first year and a half that he was there, we had regular meetings where I'd meet them every 6 to 12 weeks, and we discussed how things had gone and whether there were other measures they could put in place, whether there was a pastoral teacher that he could talk to whenever he was feeling angry, etc. But it is really hard.
We had a great experience with our local school just around the corner as well, and they've been very understanding, but every now and then there's something that happens. Like I got an email from the school saying, we're going to be talking about babies and how people grow, so please send in a photo of your child as a baby.
Oh gosh.
I was like, you guys know how is this even happening? And I just had to go through a whole thing, because that's really triggering when everyone in the class has a photo of them as a baby and he doesn't have a photo of himself as a baby, and just all these little things that you have to kind of constantly remind people of.
And I don't know how you feel, Chris. This is back to your society not making concessions. I have to say it makes me very much more assertive in certain situations than I ever would have been before, because of course you're doing it on behalf of your duckling, and just putting people right and saying, well, that's not how it is, and families can be all shapes and sizes, and I have to say that was one of our concerns moving to Sussex, because of course it's rather conservative with all sorts of C's around here. But actually, it's been incredibly accepting. I mean, in some ways, more than London, I think, in a weird way. But anyway, that's a by the by.
Have you all had to make changes to the way you work, just to bring this back specifically to adopters who work in our industry, in a way that any parent would? We all, when we become parents, I guess, have to think about the way we work, or make changes to the way we've worked. But do you think there's anything specific to adoptive parents that would be worth considering for anybody who's watching this who works in the music industry and is thinking about adopting?
I'll just, if you don't mind, go first. Just when Riley came to us, I put in my notice for a long-term contract in Göttingen, because that took me away for 2 months. It actually took a long time before that was finished. So I was aiming to be away less, and to be somewhere where I could commute much more easily, and I would have it not necessarily written into the contract, but so one job I came back every Wednesday midweek, so I would be away from Monday, Tuesday, come back on a Wednesday, go back Thursday, Friday, come back Saturday, Sunday. So that I was trying to be more. I have to say, since the pandemic, and also we were very badly flooded in our new house in Sussex, so we're making up for. So I'm just working as hard as I possibly can. So I'm away much more than I was pre-pandemic when Riley came to us. But somehow I think because he's been here with us now 5 years, as I said earlier on, the being away isn't such a big issue, and I am able to take him with me a lot of the time. And even if that's just for the weekend, I think that it makes a difference for him to see where I am working, have that connection, meet the people I'm working with, and he's fallen in love with many a soprano and a mezzo soprano in the operas that I'm doing, and they will take him backstage, and then he meets them for the it's a nice. I think he feels part of that, but it didn't go according to the plan, because I was hoping to be around much more.
I think it's hard to say, having not been a birth parent. I don't know how differently I would have arranged my life. One thing I have to say, as an adopted mother, everything is intact down here. So, I mean, that I had to deal with, the process of adoption, which is incredibly intrusive, but physically, it didn't affect my singing at all.
Yeah.
I mean, other than the lack of sleep, but that goes with everything, and all the diseases they bring into the house, of course. But so that is, from a singing point of view, perhaps a small bonus as a woman.
I didn't think of that.
Yeah.
I was really fortunate that before, so we actually wanted to adopt a year before we entered the process. I think I made the phone call, and then about a month later, my mom unfortunately dropped dead. She had a massive cardiac arrest, which was non-recoverable, which is very unexpected. And as a result of that bereavement, they made us delay it until the following year, about 10 months later. So for me, I'd kind of already made a decision that if we were going to adopt, I was going to be the one to continue singing, because as a singer, there was really no financial support. There was no, I really didn't even, I wasn't even allowed to kind of go for things like statutory adoption leave or anything. There was no financial support for me. So it was just decided that Jonathan would be the person that would go on full-time adoption support, adoption leave. But I was also in a PAYE job, which is my job at one of the conservatoires, whether I'm a professor or voice at one of the conservatoires. And so I was fortunate that I had that. And I'd gone from a very small studio to a very big studio quickly after starting. So it meant that financially, I didn't need to go away as much. And I'd already spoken and made a decision that I would do more concert work than operatic work, which kind of is what I've continued to do. I suppose the last operatic thing that I would have done was just before the pandemic. Well, actually, it was during the pandemic, and that was Street Scene with Opera North. So, in many ways, it was, I definitely scaled back some of the work that I was doing, but I was fortunate that I had a different income. I diversified my income so that because I was I'm the, what do they call it, the breadwinner. I'm the person who earns probably the more handsome figure in the house. So it made financial sense. I would have liked to have stayed at home, but it would not have been it wouldn't have been possible.
I think we need to wrap up, because I promised you guys this would only be an hour, and I've had an hour and a half of your time.
Can I just say one more thing about that, which is a benefit I felt of music making post-adoption, is that I feel much less insecure about what I do, because I come from home where I feel like I'm making it up all the time. As Chris has said, whatever training you've had, it never quite seems to fit the situation you're in. You're flailing around, and then you go to work, you think, oh, come on, Laurence. So I know how to do this. This is what I can do. and I care, I care less. I care much less about what people think about me as a result of it, because I just really enjoy and engage with the time very well,
That's a really great point. My last question, which I think we've covered really, was going to be what advice would you offer specifically to musicians or people who work in our industry who are thinking about heading down this route? For me, coming into this conversation completely green, one of the big takeaways for me has been the length of time that the process takes. I think a lot of
unpredictability of it. I think what Laurence was saying about be prepared to have to pull out of things and say no, like last minute, and just understand the I guess get your priorities straight in your head before going in. I think
it's also worth bearing in mind that almost by definition these days, thank goodness society has changed its views on marriage and all sorts of things, but an adopted child will come with some form of trauma, so, and you won't necessarily know from the reports what that trauma is, and it will reveal itself. I mean, it also brings so much joy, of course, but I think it is worth and that is also part of it. There's a lot of unpredictability.
The trauma is also unpredictable in how it presents. You might know a fair amount, and then it might surprise you. I mean, through our entire process, it was always our eldest who was going to be the difficult one, who had the most trauma. And in fact, he's the one who responds the best to all the therapy, who's doing quite well. And our youngest one, who supposedly had a much better start, is the one who suffers the most from like extreme anxiety and all sorts of things. So yeah, it's a very important point, understanding that going in.
I think my only the advice that I would give is that you're at the mercy of the social worker that's assessing you and the child's social worker. Be prepared to push, be prepared to be aggressive, be prepared to get what you need. Don't trust that the information that you're being given is accurate, because it's based upon information that social services have been given by a birth parent who sees social services as a threat. So the information may not always be clear. You may be told that there aren't drugs, or wasn't alcohol, or that there wasn't violence, but effectively it may come out later on that it is. That trauma isn't just one thing. It evolves, and actually the trauma can grow even while they're in your care, and it can evolve while it's in your care. You've got to be prepared to say the wrong thing. You've got to be prepared to fail. You've got to be prepared to look at yourself and say, I didn't do that well today, but I can do it better tomorrow, and be okay about that. I think the biggest thing is, I think the biggest battle for anybody going into adoption, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's the most amazing thing I've ever done. I've worked in some wonderful buildings with some wonderful conductors, some wonderful orchestras, and I've been very blessed in my journey, in my career. But what I will say is, none of it feels as amazing as what it feels to have my boys at home. Don't get me wrong, their diseases are not so nice. I've got to be honest, I've really suffered, especially in the last 6 months. But, there's nothing like a baby's kind of almost saying I love you and then sneezing in your face. There is, it's amazing. But I think the process itself is not a straight line, and it's not linear, and it doesn't curve. It quite often does this. And you've got to really push, but also be prepared for the fact that you are going to cover your own life story. And some people have traumatic lives. And remember that that's going to come up. And don't be surprised if you have to go and chat to a GP and say, well, I was going through some of my adoption and this came up and I hadn't thought about it for a long time. Because human beings are very good at closing doors on trauma, very good at closing doors on very dark parts of their life. And unfortunately, a social worker will open that door. They want to. Don't see mental health issues or health issues as being something to hold you back. I'm very fortunate. I don't think I've ever really suffered any kind of mental health issues. I've been through some really rough stuff. I'm 41 and I've lost both my parents. They both died very unexpectedly. And that for me has been very difficult. That's a very difficult, traumatic part of my life with my children, because my mum was this big bumbly kind of grandma who loved, Nan, she'd hate being called grandma, who loved children. She used to say that, if I knew grandchildren were this much fun, I'd have had lots more very early on, and unfortunately she never got to meet my children. But it's the most wonderful journey, but probably one of the most stressful things you're ever going to do in your life. It really makes you assess who you are as a person, and what makes you who you are as well. And I think you've got to be really willing to delve into that. Lots of us in our past have done things that we shouldn't have done, or that, we've had things happen to us that we kind of closed the door on. And it's only when a social worker says, and how did that make you feel? That you go, and then all of a sudden it spurts out. So for example, my partner, and I don't think he'd mind me telling you, definitely got something called post-adoption depression. There is postnatal depression. There's something very much associated with adoption as well. It comes with the lows of what can come. Our social worker basically said, here you go, here's a child. I'll see you in 3 weeks. I'm on the end of the phone if you need me. And literally, I suppose that's what it's like when a mom is given a baby, although you've had all the preparation of being pregnant, but effectively that baby's placed in your arm, and all the preparation you've done, all the reading we've done, all the courses we've done, the theraplay, the therapeutic parenting, the primal wound, the body keeps the score, all those books that we've read count for nothing. Because actually you can't decompartmentalize them all while this living thing in front of you that's amazing is creating havoc or being wonderful or sneezing on you or whatever else, My advice is always to do it. If you think you can do it, you've got to say to yourself, you've always got to try, but be prepared to fail. But failure doesn't necessarily mean that you won't become an adopter. Sometimes it takes 6 months. Ideally, the process should take no longer than 9 months. That's what the local authority and VA should be getting children placed or prospective adopters, once they've been approved, should be placed with the child within 9 months. But quite often it doesn't happen. Some people it's years. But it takes some people years to have children naturally as well. You know, but my advice would be to do it always, because they're amazing.
It is wonderful.
Children are incredible and stressful.
It's not unlike the sort of advice that I give to people who ask me, you know, should I have children as an artist, as a singer? Should I have children, or am I crazy? And I always say it's so worth it for all the shit that comes.
Advise anybody thinking of doing it to talk to somebody if they could.
Yes.
Or talk to an adopter before. Talking to Laurence and Martin before we did it was really, really, really useful. Thank you, Laurence.
Well, it was useful for us to upload, and I can't believe we didn't put you off.
I've had about 30 chats now, I think it is, with people who not singers. Sometimes it's, you know, people who have said to me, "Oh, I've got a friend. Could you have a chat with them?"
Yeah.
And I'm always really honest.
Yeah.
But try and balance it and say, you know, because it is. I mean, I don't know. I'd say 65-70% of the time, I love being a papa. 30% of the time, sometimes I sit there and go, what on earth have I done? But that's only maybe for about 3 weeks of the year.
Yeah.
You know, and if you, to be honest with you, Laurence, you're a braver man than me. To have a really long Easter, you know, break, that's very brave. I don't think I could do 4 weeks.
Well, I kind of, I mean, to be honest, it's interesting you bring that up, because Martin, my partner, thought I was absolutely mad to take Riley to Frankfurt for 18 days. I took him away, just the two of us.
Amazing.
But I sort of feel, in a way, because I could do it. I mean, of course, for those 2 weeks, I spent so much more money than I would have done on my own. You know, I mean, I don't think I would have earned anything in those 2 weeks. If anything, I was spent money, you know. But I sort of feel like it's paying back time when I have been away. And if I hadn't taken him, I would have been away and not seen him probably for 18 days. So the difference is, you know, and you're exhausted. I mean, you're exhausted in a way that you know, you used to remember saying you were exhausted, and it's like, well, you weren't exhausted, you were just a bit tired, you know. But I mean, that's parenting, isn't it? And as you say, you're doing the ridiculously early start to get home so that you can be there for breakfast time, or whatever it is you're doing, these insane schedules. But I mean, I've always found it's worth doing, because I think just the presence is useful. So just that thing of it you talked about, I think, pretty much, because we heard lots of horror stories before we as we were embarking on the journey, but I've not met an adopter who doesn't say, even if they've had awful things happen to them, that they regret having adopted. Because even if it's gone totally wrong, the young adult is off the rails, they will have something that they can refer back to. So they have a way of getting back on track, because they've had some stable environment in their life, you know, and I suppose ultimately that's just a good thing.
You know what might not circumvent, but might show you the other end of adoption? I don't know whether any of you know Sarah Pring, but she adopted. She works at Guildhall and I think Trinity, and obviously is a mezzo. I have her contact details. It might be really interesting for you to have a chat. So you've got the other end of the scale, and she would have adopted way before any of us did, where things were very, very different. You know, very open about the fact that our kids are adopted because we're two men. But you know, I think she would have adopted in a time where it was where they didn't really talk about life story. They didn't really talk about the fact that you were adopted, and sometimes they found out much later. But she was someone I contacted and spoke to about adoption, even though she'd adopted a much before I even thought about it. Might be an interesting perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because her children will be probably in their 20s now, I would have thought, if not older.
Yeah, no, that would be great to chat to her. Right, guys, I'm going to let you go, but thank you. This has been really, really fascinating, and I think would be just so valuable to anybody who's thinking about doing this. So I really appreciate your time. You've given me nearly 2 hours, and we could have gone on. There are so many more.
We so could.
It's wonderful.
Next time.
really generous of you to give me so much honesty and openness and wisdom. So good luck, and maybe we'll catch up in a few years and do a reunion.
Great.
Amazing.
Brilliant.
Meet you all.
Bye.
Thank you. Lovely to see you.
Bye.
Take care.